One of the great things I remember when you did
the
Candace Owens' show.
Yeah.
And Candace Owens, who's now made herself very famous in the anti-Semite world.
Very famous.
Very famous.
Huge in the anti-Semite world. She's doing so great. So huge for the
You know, that's hard to do because it's very competitive in the anti-Semite world.
These days, absolutely.
There's more than 1 billion people who are vying for that role.
It's very hard.
To take the top
Somebody's
spot.
like, well, I hate the Jews, and I'm not getting noticed at all. How are you doing it? But she's, she's really gone pretty off the rails with it. But in the earlier stages when she was just flirting with anti-Semitism, she had you on the show to defend being Jewish. And I thought you were great. You were very articulate. I told you at the time when we saw each other at the Lighthouse, I was like, I often will watch these things and I kind of cringe because I'm like, this person's representing me in a weird way as a Jew. And I'm like, I would have been able to handle that better, or whatever, but or I wouldn't be able to handle that well, but this person didn't either. But like when I watched Ami do it, I thought if I had the skills, that's exactly how I would want to do it,
Thanks.
And it was interesting because she couldn't help but love your impressions. Like at the end, like he does Jordan Peterson for her, and like she lights up, like she's so excited. And she can't even pretend not to like him at that point in the interview.
Well, you could still like the person's talent. You don't even know you disagree with.
Well, she's pro one Semite.
Right. You've got her.
I said to her in my second conversation, I was like, look, I don't know if you're anti-Semitic or not, but you're definitely anti a few Semites, right? Let's talk about that. And I think that human beings are complicated. And I think oftentimes we look at these things, and it's understandable in a post-October 7th world that us as a community sort of say, okay, this or that. It's very much a binary, and we understandably need to start categorizing things to say, okay, the stakes are high, we're in danger, our community's in a very vulnerable position. Where do you stand? And we draw these lines. And the problem is when people cross those lines and say things that are objectionable, a lot of people take this approach of siloing themselves off and saying, I'm going to call that person out and write some hit piece article or make a video saying how disgusting. But at a certain point in the early stages of this, when people were looking at the situation in Israel and what was going on with the Jewish community here, there was a chance to say, look, like, are we so fragile? Are we so vulnerable that to simply engage with people who are saying things that are very objectionable, things that we disagree with, I think we can handle ourselves. And I think we're strong enough and resilient enough to engage, be civil, make a good impression, and show how constructive dialogue can work. And maybe that's a better way than simply patting ourselves on the back and siloing ourselves off. And there's a case to be made for that. And I think at a certain point, people do cross the line and they're not engageable at that point, or they're not acting in good faith. And that is sort of a case by case basis. But certainly in the beginning, when I was starting to see this rift, our conversation started because I called her out on Twitter through something that I thought was objectionable. Because she was a fan of the comedy, she invited me on to talk, and it was a really constructive, good conversation. And I think that there's a human element to all of this, where in her case, I think it's a lot about temperament and loyalty and people she finds favor in and people she doesn't. And I'm not making excuses, but I think there's ways to circumvent those tribal lines, and comedy is certainly a way to do that.
So, see, when he says things like circumvent tribal lines, I can't come up with wording like that.
No, circumvent is...
Well, when you do impersonations of intellectuals for like 3 years, your verbal fluency increases a little bit,
Candace Owens was very close to Dennis Prager.
Sure.
Worked with him. He totally respected it. Had no inkling that this woman was going in this direction. I wonder if she always was there and hid it. It's interesting. She had the Kanye thing, right?
Yeah.
She had Kanye, but Trump also met with Kanye after the whole anti-Semitism thing.
That was a little bit of a setup, actually. The behind the scenes of that was, there was a bit of a troll move to like have Kanye meet with Trump and Nick Fuentes and all these things and sort of make Trump seem by association.
By the way, like can we just say for 1 second, how cool of a name is Fuentes? I mean, I know he hates Jews and everything, but I like the name Fuentes.
I'll give it
Fuentes.
And then Nick is such a common name to pair with Fuentes.
Fuentes, it's weird for the most prominent white supremacist anti-Semite to have a Hispanic last name. I'll give you that.
Nick Fuentes. All right, so let's go back to the question, because I was also very distracted with the camera. Let's take it from your question about Prager from the beginning.
So I think in terms of your question,
just for editing,
take the question.
Let's start it over from the question. If you thought it was genuine,
right? So I thought Candace Owens, she worked with Prager, with a lot of Jews. She really seemed to be in their corner. Prager got her own podcast. So I can't believe that he knew anything that, how deeply rooted this anti-Semitism was in her. It's not like, and then one day it just sprung out of her.
Yeah, I mean, like there's a psychoanalytical element to it that feels a little uncomfortable for me to go there, but I will, because why not? We're just schmoozing about it. I mean, I don't think she was secretly hiding a deep, dark Jew hatred all this time and went, ha, gotcha, Jews.
Right.
I don't think it's that. I think for her, she's operates from a place of, one, let's say genuine intellectual curiosity. So there's a part of it that is that, like, I think the conservatives might have assumed she was more of an intellectual than she was more of just a commentator. And that when you don't know what you don't know, then when you start to look into things and think you're making these revelations, you're actually just kind of revealing a little bit of ignorance about the history of anti-Semitism or the history of Jewish prominence or involvement, and drawing strange connections. But when the conservatives as a whole kind of pedestaled her as some intellectual that might have been misguided, and then it comes back to bite you. And, and you could see it early on in certain things in podcast interviews where she would reveal like that now that I'm, good on certain issues like BLM or speaking out against Blexit or, that the black community doesn't have to be owned by the Democratic Party, all valid points. And I think from personal experience, she could speak to that with a little more authority. But then things can get a little tribal and say, now on climate change, I'm going to reject all that. And I'm going to go on Joe Rogan and say, I just don't believe in climate change. I mean, we're all tribal actors in a way, but you kind of adopt a certain platform and say, I'm going to go out and defend all those positions. And that can happen in this space. And everybody's guilty of that confirmation bias in some way. So I can understand that. And I don't mean to, I'm not trying to just throw shade. I'm just saying, I think everybody from a place of humility can observe that in themselves and in this people in the commentariat. And that's what's happening.
I thought when she showed up on one of the shows wearing a brown shirt and the armband, I said, that's kind of, I looked and I asked other people and they said, don't worry about it.
It's okay.
But we learned a lot.
She just waves like that. It's not a big deal.
Let's just take a minute, because you can learn a lot from your supporters, but you learn a lot from your critics too, for better and for worse. There are some things that are obviously worth challenging and some things that you have to go, wait a second. Now, if I'm trying to follow the trajectory, there were a lot of Jewish organizations and Jews on the left who were criticized by Jews on the right, like Prager and Shapiro, for kind of getting on board with the whole identity politics thing and calling everything anti-Semitic, and just like a lot of liberals were calling everything racist and finding things that weren't there, or firing Whoopi Goldberg because she made some weird comment about the Holocaust from a place of ignorance, and we said, oh, she needs to go to retraining, and like we patted but a lot of I won't have to name names, but we all know that we would pat ourselves on the back for saying we're combating anti-Semitism, but I think you're really just pushing people away.
Right.
And I think people like Ben Shapiro and Prager were just as critical as a Candace Owens would have been of those kinds of people, even Jewish organizations that were getting on the train of wanting to be part of the marginalized communities that were calling out anti-Semitism and racism where it does not exist. And that was not productive. But post-October 7th, when we saw this rise in anti-Semitism and support for Hamas across university campuses and across Europe, just because you can be critical of calling out anti-Semitism where it doesn't exist doesn't mean that when it does exist, you don't call it out because you don't want to be called a leftist.
Right.
I mean, being able to use critical thinking and walk and chew gum at the same time was the problem. And that's what I spoke to her about in our first conversation. It's like, look, you can still be intellectually consistent and say, hey, that's anti-Semitic or that's wrong. But I think if I'm getting psychoanalytical about it, it's like part of it is when you're in a position where your temperament is to go against the grain. It's good to go against the grain, but I guess it all depends what the grain is. And
when she knows,
certain
she knows that she's anti-Semitic?
No, she will tell you to the core she's not anti-Semitic. Yeah. She will say that. But I told her, I think the mistake a lot of people make when criticizing her, and I'll sort of wrap up here, is like, on this point, it's hard to tell somebody what they feel in their own heart. We really don't know what anybody is inside. You can only judge behavior and statement. So I said, look, and a lot of people, when they would call her an anti-Semite, she would just put up the defenses. And I think one of the reasons our conversations were so constructive is because if she tells me personally I'm not anti-Semitic, or somebody tells you they're not racist, then I believe them. But that's separate from the behavior. And I can say, listen, you just might not be sensitive to the statements you're making and the things you're engaging in, these tropes that you might not be aware of what these things actually mean historically And if I'm taking what you word that you don't have animosity towards like individual Jewish people, then or Jews as a whole, even that's irrelevant, because what you're actually doing is still providing a lot of red meat and providing excuses and apologies for people who do hate Jews, and you're creating this atmosphere. Whether or not you feel it in your own heart isn't really my concern. I'm judging behavior, actions, and statements and things that you're doing, and I think
And it's not helpful to call us Juden, I don't think.
And I being animated by anti-Semitic ideas is definitely something going on there. And I think also it's a personal thing, like having experience with whether it's the Daily Wire or a certain political culture that accepts certain viewpoints, where the majority of people are very pro-Israel. There's an instinct possibly in her to like question and be like, wait a minute, I don't just want to think that and for thinking that's sake, and then push back against that. And some people say it's just to get a reaction, just to get clicks. Look, I don't know, but there's certainly a pattern going on here. It's very disturbing, and it's disturbed me. It's disturbed Prager. He's tried to point it out.
He did, and
he said, for reasons only God knows. For reasons only God knows. I don't know. For reasons only God knows. I don't know she has gone completely haywire on Israel and the Jewish community. For reasons only God knows. But remember, it was left-wing Jews she was battling that called her a Nazi when she was speaking about Hitler at any point before October 7th. And I think she's lumping it all into the same boat in some way, too.
I'll tell you this, Mark. I had a career setback once some years ago, and I didn't understand why it happened.
Yes.
And I was trying to figure it out, and I was Googling things, and I was Googling people. Before I knew it, I realized it was all the Jews. Mm-hmm. And I'm not even kidding. I was like, it all goes back to the Jews. So, like, if you go down any, like, conspiracy rabbit hole on the internet, it all paths lead to the Jews at the end. Like... So I remember, like, looking at all this and being like...
Let's clip this. Let's just clip this.
I remember looking at it and being like, well, that's interesting. So the Jews are behind it, huh? And then I was like, wait, that's obviously not true. Of course. But all the logic seems to work out up until that point. So as somebody was not looking for the answer of the Jews did it, like, I got there, which was interesting, I thought, you know?
Yeah. So, you know the joke about the two old Jewish guys. One is reading the... Nazi newspaper. You know that show?
No, go ahead.
So these two old Jewish guys are from Europe, and one guy is reading the Nazi newspaper. His friend goes, Saul, what do you Nazi newspaper? He says, I love this paper. He goes, what do you love about it? He goes, because it says we're doing so well. We run real estate, we run politics, we own the banks. This is great.